Can everybody hear? Yeah? I should probably make clear that I'm Jonathan and you're Joyce.
Thank you. Can you hear me too?
There's no Knicks fans in the audience?
We can't see anything. It's completely blinding.
Yeah.
Gives us a false sense of something.
Security.
Security.
Yeah.
We're not sure that there is an audience there, but they make little sounds once in a while.
Before we went on, I asked Joyce if she was nervous or if she ever gets nervous, and you resolutely no.
I'm beyond it.
You're beyond it. I'm not beyond it. And I get more nervous the more intimate the event is.
Oh, right.
So the worst thing that can ever happen is having to give a toast in front of like 5 or 6 people that I know really well. And my hands will like tremble like this.
I think I understand that. Yeah.
But this doesn't scare me because there's nothing there.
Well, you're probably used to like 20,000 people in a stadium.
No. 5 or 6. So I've known Joyce for half of my life at this point, which is really remarkable. As was mentioned, we met when I was a freshman at Princeton. And I took her creative writing workshop really on a whim. I had no ambitions to write at the time.
It's so hard to believe. Yeah.
I took it as I took abnormal psychology or Russian cinema. Just it sounded interesting, and why not give it a shot? And I think it's the hardest I've ever tried in a class, both because Joyce has a way of inspiring effort and a creative spirit and ambition, and I think a fear of, this is going to sound like a joke, but I'm saying quite a positive thing, a fear of disappointing you. I know a lot of my experience and other of your students who I've spoken to have wanted to do their best for you, in addition to doing their best in front of you.
That's so touching.
And over the course of the 4 years that we knew each other, we both worked in an academic setting, and Joyce would write letters to my home in DC during spring break and winter break. You would leave messages. One of my maybe my most vivid memory of my college experience was when we were working on Everything is Illuminated together. It was the first time I experimented with that Alex voice, and I sent you the first chapter, and you left a message on my dorm room machine, which required you having looked up my number somehow and extended yourself in that way. And without exaggeration, I have never been happier as a writer than I was then with one reader. And
well, that was a wonderful voice. I mean, obviously, it was one of your own voices, maybe sort of like a secondary voice, this comic voice that I don't think I'd actually seen you do before. So it sort of came out of somewhere, and it was really delightful. And I think really made the novel. And reviewers loved it because it was so funny and sardonic. Then in the novel, there was a character named Jonathan Safran Foer, so he's kind of this bumbling vegetarian.
Yeah.
It was ingenious, really.
And so Joyce inspired me to become a writer, and Joyce also inspired me to become a teacher. Not only inspired me, but facilitated my life as a teacher. You got in touch, you might not even remember, you got in touch with the director of the NYU writing program and said, I think this person would be a good teacher. And I went back and I looked at my response to Deborah, and I said, what can I say about Joyce? No one has changed my life so dramatically. Of course, I could also say that she's the most creative, energetic, original person I know. I would love the opportunity to try to change someone else's life as she changed mine. So this is all a way of saying I'm incredibly grateful to you and grateful to be here today to talk about Letters to a Biographer. So as I mentioned, you sent letters to my home in DC when I was in college. And I remember my dad opened one by accident. And in a funny way, it implicated him in my life as a writer. Then it became a topic of conversation, and you legitimized, I think for him, a dream that I was beginning to have. I think the thing that surprised me more than anything else in this book was the presence of your parents.
Yeah.
It's something that you and I have not really spoken about. You don't write about it very much, and it was woven through this book, whether it was hoping that they would see positive reviews, whether it was not wanting them to see certain stories like Zombie when that was in the New Yorker, or there's a really lovely passage from one of your letters where you said, "I guess I will have to send what I live for to my parents. I feel reluctant given the novel's special tone, its macho vulgarity. My father's eyesight, too, makes reading increasingly difficult, and a novel of this length, so densely printed, will fill him with dismay." I found that so thoroughly touching and so resonant with a lot of my own really deep experiences as a writer. So I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about your parents and talk a little bit about what their relationship was and actually still is to your writing.
Well, it's a very touching subject, and of course it's very close to my heart. But I was sort of hurriedly reading this book on the way into New York. I had almost been afraid to look at it because these personal letters go back for decades to a much happier time in my life. I mean, right now, I've sort of lost a lot of people who meant a lot to me, including my parents. So reading a book like that and sort of seeing those letters, it's a very bittersweet experience because I'm writing about my parents and they're alive. You know, it's all like present tense. And now I've just sort of lost them. But one of the things that I noticed that I sort of leapt out at me as I was hurriedly reading these letters, that somebody had said to me, "Joyce, it's so strange that you identify so much with your parents at your age." I mean, I might have been 50 at the time, I don't really remember. And I thought, how odd that somebody would say that. I mean, of course we identify with our parents, and it's not just that we love our parents, but we kind of have internalized our parents, you know. But that I identify with my parents at my age seemed to this person strange. And there are a number of people, many women whom I know, who are really adversarial relationship with their mothers. And they don't get along, or they love each other, but they fight, you know. And I didn't have anything like that. Well, both my parents had to give up at being educated when they were quite young. They didn't finish 8th grade. And we were from upstate New York. And then the great drama of my life that was so revealed really much later was that my grandmother, my father's mother, was Jewish. But that was kept completely secret, and nobody knew it. She didn't acknowledge it. And I think that her family came from Germany in the 1890s, and nobody really knows why they went to upstate New York, north of Buffalo. You know, like, why not go to the Lower East Side where they would fit in? But they made a real deliberate choice to go like north of Buffalo, which seems awfully masochistic in a way, but then not have any cultural identity. So my grandmother sort of vaguely would indicate she was Protestant, maybe, or if she had to write something down on a form. But it must have been just wanting to make a new start, I guess, because of the anti-Semitism in Europe and sort of just the exhaustion of dealing with history. So my father didn't know that he was the son of a Jewish woman. But what came out gradually was that my grandmother was the only one in a huge family, Hungarians, Irish, German Jews, but Hungarians and Irish sort of pretty prominently. But she was the only one who read books. And she was the only one who would give me books for all my birthdays and for Christmas. So it's kind of like this mystery that came out gradually, like, why is my grandmother Woodside always giving people books? So I guess, you know, just given this sort of predilection for books and her background. She and my parents were the great influences in my life. So my grandmother, Morgenstern, was her name, and it was changed to Morning Star. I guess that was pretty obvious that they were Jewish, but anyway, that's what happened. She gave me a copy of Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass when I was 9 years old. And I think that had the most pervasive sort of rippling effect through my whole life. You know, that sense of absurdity and humor and but gravity. And did you read that novel when you were little? Do you remember how old you were?
I remember that my dad read it to me. So
oh, that's wonderful.
Whatever age that was, yeah.
Yeah, maybe before you could read. That's great.
So when you know you were writing about, I hope that my parents read this, or I would just assume they didn't read that.
Right.
One of the really strange things about a collection of letters to a biographer, or just collaborating with a biographer, is there is an undeniable awareness of your readership. You know, I think a lot of writers go to lengths to pretend they don't think about it, maybe as a self-protective mechanism, or because they don't want to seem as if they assume an importance. But once you're at the level of having a biographer and you know, communicating about things like one standing in the pantheon of American writers or posterity, it's self-conscious, that relationship to readers. So I'm curious about how over time you have thought about whom it is that you are writing to. Like, has it been parents? Has it been partners? Has it been imagined readers? Has it been purely self-expressive?
Well, it's a curious question because probably like you, I mean, probably most writers are writing to sort of realize the integrity of that particular work. You know, if you're writing something about, say, a very intellectual person, say you're Thomas Mann, and you're reading Dr. Faustus, you know, you have the language and the kind of density of thought and this particular speech, the idiomatic or rhythmic speech that's particular to that subject. So you sort of have to realize that, and then if 5 people are going to read it, oh fine, or 50 people, you can't really think about that. I mean, when you've done a lot of experimental work, and when you were doing some of your experimental work with Bruno Schulz, I mean, you can explain what this is, but I would guess that you were not thinking who would read it. Weren't you just thinking of the art of that work?
I was. That book was a little different because I knew there was no hope
Almost
of anybody
no,
reading it.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of an art. It's sort of an artifact.
I think I look at it a little differently, which is not the integrity of a particular project, but the integrity of the creator of that project. And I am less concerned with making something coherent as a work of art than I am feeling like an internal coherence. You know, feeling. So this is, I think, what I mean. When the first time you ever spoke to me outside of class, I arrived early to class, and you arrived early, and you said, "Oh, I'm glad that you arrived early. I just wanted to tell you that I'm a fan of your writing." And it was a revelation, not for the obvious reason, which is a great American writer saying something nice, but because I didn't know there was such a thing as my writing.
As your writing. Well,
it just never occurred to me.
Well, that's typical. I don't think people necessarily know that they have a style. Well, we both teach at NYU now, which is kind of wonderful, just sort of an accident. But all of my students at NYU, they're older, and in the sense that graduate writers, they almost all have a voice. You know, like there's a distinctive voice. If I didn't know the name of some of the students on the manuscript, I could probably guess who it is. And some of the voices are more distinct than others. I mean, obviously there are some voices that are more conventional, but then there are kind of weird voices. You know, like think, oh, this is strange. So you were kind of in that category because you were always doing something experimental. It was sort of like adjacent to a real short story that somebody else might be struggling to write. You would do something adjacent to that. I can't really explain it, but it wasn't an attempt to write a conventional story. Jonathan wasn't trying to do that. He was doing something else. Now, whatever you thought you were doing, it's almost irrelevant because whatever you did was this particular expression of your strange aesthetics. You were always very experimental. Like when you write anything, it's not conventional. Because maybe you don't know how to write. I don't know what goes through your brain, but I feel that way about my own. I feel that way about my own writing too. I don't want to write a well-structured, conventional, like perfect novel, let's say. I would rather do something that's actually a little weird and it's come from an odd perspective. And then I would like the language to be something strange, maybe just no subjects, just using verbs or something playful. Yeah, so probably you're the only one in the workshop who was doing anything like that. And then soon after you graduated, you did that Joseph Cornell sort of anthology, which in itself was very experimental. So I think you were adjacent also to art, like the visual art. You're drawn to that.
You said that you are good at not that you're good at, but you are capable of recognizing the voices of your students, right? And you suggested that you can recognize a voice of mine. That's something that's sort of parallel to writers having projects that are in and of themselves that have a distinctness and an authenticity. Do you think that you have a voice?
Well, my voice, I probably do. I probably can't escape it, but I try to have a different voice for everything I write. That's why the letters are so strange to read, because they're kind of aw shucks, earnest, Girl Scout kind of writing without any irony or anything. They're just kind of gushing sometimes. I think I was typing really rapidly to my biographer friend, and I would say, "Hi, thank you for this, and it was really nice to see you, and how was your dash hound?" And we had dinner last night with some people. Sort of just like a style that's no style at all. It's not quite as bad as Sylvia Plath's writings to her mother. You know, the letters of, you know, Sylvia, maybe some of you do. Sylvia's letters home to her mother, they are astonishing. They are completely antithetical to the real Sylvia Plath. She kept a journal, a diary, she wrote her work, and that's where you see the real Sylvia Plath. Then she writes these letters home to her mother, and they're all sunny, and everything is wonderful, and I baked a pie, and we did this, and Ted is just the most darling hubby. And when you read them, they come to an end when she commits suicide. Like, there's just no hint of anything in those letters home by Sylvia Plath. So my letters are not quite like that, but they're just not letters that I would find interesting at all. They're just kind of, I can't somehow believe that I wrote all those letters. But they have a kind of morbid fascination because I'd forgotten a number of things. And then they sort of leap out at me. Like one of them was Playboy magazine asked me quite a while ago, to interview a person named Donald Trump. Like, why would... And then Tina Brown at the New Yorker asked me if I would like to go out to a prison in Ohio and interview Mike Tyson, at the time incarcerated. So these things I'd sort of blessedly forgotten, but they're in there. But you were asking about the voice of each work that I do. The fiction is an expression of that particular novel or short story. I try to make it different. Now, in Ulysses, James Joyce has all these different styles. There are, 12 or 13 different styles that he has, but you can actually see it's always James Joyce. There's sort of Joycean rhythms and this sort of Irish idiomatic speech. You can kind of see it all the way through James Joyce. So he thought he was doing that, and he does to a degree, astonishing. But still, you can see it's Joyce. So maybe people can see that. It's this other Joyce.
You make people laugh a lot. You're a very, very funny person. And one of the lines that keeps coming up throughout this book, you quote Updike a few times,
yes.
Having said, "For God's sake, lighten up, Joyce."
For God's sake, lighten up, Joyce. Yeah, he was reading my books. My books are not so funny, I think. John Updike and I had a really nice friendship because we almost never saw each other. It was epistolary. He read these little cards. I have hundreds of these cards of John's. They were really wonderful. And so I was giving my archive to Syracuse University with the stipulation that nobody should read these letters of Updike, and other people too, until like 2025. That seemed a long time ago then. And John wrote back and he said, "Joyce, I don't plan to be around in 2025. He actually could be around. I mean, that was an odd thing to say. He said, "Lighten up. I want people to read my letters. You don't have to put any constraints on it." So I thought that was very interesting. Now his wife, or his widow, Martha, she was sort of the opposite. She didn't want his letters published. So that was a strange sort of reversal. For God's sake, lighten up, Joyce. That was very touching.
Make a great T-shirt.
Yeah.
A lot of the authors that you mentioned in this book, people that you were reading, people that you were peers with, people that you're corresponding with, have passed away.
Yes.
And I have a friend who lost his parents in the same year, 2 or 3 years ago, and he said it feels like being unceilinged, like there's suddenly nobody above me. And we talked a little bit about how being unceilinged may have influenced your identity as a writer. How have the deaths of peers made you think about their work, about your own work, about your communications with them?
Well, I probably feel the way you feel too, Jonathan. It's sort of hard to talk about that. Life seems, as we get older, it seems sort of like a white water raft that we're on, going down this tumultuous, like the Colorado River. And some people are in their own rafts and they've crashed on the boulders. And you just think, how long can I keep this going, before it crashes somewhere? It's sort of a sense of ongoing wonder. I think the first deaths in our families are often grandparents. And that, in some ways, casts an enormous shadow there. You're just kind of little, and somebody you've never known the world without, the grandparents. Then suddenly one day they're gone. I think ontologically that's very unsettling, a sort of disequilibrium. And each one after that is maybe not so shocking until the death of a spouse or someone with whom you're actually living, which is completely unsettling. It's sort of like you've lost a limb, The deaths of people who are our own age are unsettling. They seem really unnatural. Yeah. I don't know how to talk about it in any specific terms. And then if you live long enough, there are so many losses that they're too many. You can't really assimilate them. But I think the first loss of the grandparents is something that casts the bigger shadow.
I had mentioned a letter that you sent home to me that my father opened, and in that letter, you said, you wrote, I can almost remember it verbatim, like the secret of writing, which is hardly a secret, is energy. The most important quality for a writer to have is energy.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about what the sources of your energy have been and how they've changed over time. Like when you were talking about losses that are too big to name or measure, I assume that influences the kind of energy that goes into your books, or maybe not.
Well, I think ideally we're sort of energized by a project that's exciting. Say you have an idea for a story or a memoir or a nonfiction book, and you're genuinely excited by it. So you really can't wait to get up in the morning, and you start working at 7 a.m. or whatever. It's a kind of natural effusion of energy. And I know actors are like that. Acting is all about energy and being sort of have a radiant presence that comes out into the audience. So that's how you can tell if a project has life. You really want to work on it. And I think that comes naturally if you're choosing something that's means something to you. Now with you, and maybe with me also, that something might be a little bit experimental, a little bit risky or odd, that adds a little to it. If I had to sit down and write a conventional short story, like in the old days, people wrote for the Saturday Evening Post. Scott Fitzgerald, I think even Faulkner, they would get like $5,000 for a story, which was a lot in those days especially. So they would sort of sit down and try to write a conventional story, and I don't actually think I could do that. I mean, I just think something would be paralyzed. I could write kind of a weird parody of a conventional story. So I think there are different kinds of writers, those who want to do something that an audience is prepared to like. It's using form or formula in a positive way. And then there are other people who sort of go against the formula and want to do something different. So I finished a novel recently, and it's probably a little bit weird, but the first chapter is from the point of view of a dog, a very sprightly female dog that's just running, got off leash, and is running. Do you like dogs? You have a dog, don't you?
I have 3 dogs. Yeah.
Well, you must like dogs if you ever. He's got 3 dogs.
It tests my patience with dogs.
Yeah. Well, if you have 3 dogs, you obviously like dogs. Yeah. But the thing is, I've never done this before. I could have begun the chapter with people, a conventional way. But I thought I'm going to do it with this woman going out. She's going running, and she goes with her dog. And the dog runs away, and the dog does all these naughty things. I think the dogs want to roll around in carrion and rotted things. And you don't really want them to do that, right? So isn't there kind of a contest with the dog's doggy self and your human self? They want to please you, but they sort of have to humor you because they really want to do the doggy thing. And so the chapter deals with that, and then this dog is drawn farther away from the humans calling to her, and she starts to smell something really delicious. And I try to express how a dog might feel some horrible, loathsome, rotted corpse. Because it's the discovery of a corpse in the novel. I usually do just begin with the corpse being discovered. I thought I'd do it this funny way with the dog, where as you're reading, you don't really know it's a corpse because the dog is getting all these sensations and it's just sniffing and is so excited and is just so thrilled. And then the chapter ends with the human being saying, "Princess Di, what is that in your mouth?" That's the end of the chapter. And I thought, the kind of
Dodi al-Fayyad.
a cute name for the dog, but the dog's got something in his mouth. The dog has something in her mouth, so we don't know what it is. We find out later.
Yeah, the only disappointing part of this whole book is what a cat person you are.
I'm a cat person.
Yeah,
Well, cats are just not like dogs. I mean, dogs are so eager to please.
That's exactly how I would put it.
Yeah. Well, the dogs are eager to please, and they actually look at you and they kind of love you, and their little tails are going. The cats could sort of care less, like a yawn. You come back from death's door, the cat is not particularly interested. The cat's sleeping, and I can understand that a little more. I don't really want an animal to be dependent on me for his happiness. Like 3 dogs are looking at you eagerly, and their little tails are going, but then if you frown, then the little tail doesn't, it's sort of not, it's like, it's sort of cruel to be a dog owner, I would think.
My dogs aren't nearly that interested in me. I think the more you have, the more they're interested in each other, and the less.
Oh, that's right. They would be interested in each other. Well, one of them's the alpha dog. You're the alpha person.
I'm the alpha. That's right.
Are you really, or do they just pretend? Let's make him think that he's the alpha.
Yeah. I have a lot of that.
And then is there a second alpha dog, like you first, and then?
It's not exactly like that. They're different. They're all rescues, and they're sort of different levels of trauma and fragility. So one of them was from Puerto Rico, from the hurricane, and that's a really somewhat scary dog.
What breed is that?
They're just what we call Brooklyn Shorthair.
Brooklyn Shorthair, yeah. But are they big or middle?
I have one that's big, one that's medium, and one that's little. Yeah. But anyway, back to you.
Well, I'm very interested in animals. The whole idea of not eating animals is a good idea. We've talked about, Jonathan wrote a book called Eating Animals. No, I'm very interested in the world of animals. I wish that I could write a little more about animals, but it's hard to do without being mawkish or sentimental.
Well, that's what's so interesting about them.
It's really challenging to do.
You were talking about the experience of reading this in the car because you couldn't bear to read it before, right?
Yeah.
So there's a passage in it when you say, you can't imagine how disorienting it is to confront these buried lost selves when the biographer, as he's doing his research, was presenting you, right, with, as I understood it, portfolios of letters from earlier times in your life.
Yes.
Why is it so hard to imagine the disorientation of confronting what you call a buried, lost self?
Well, let's see. We probably don't live any longer in a world in which people are writing letters to each other anymore. They may write emails or text messages, but I think the idea of writing a long letter that might be, 7 pages long, putting in an envelope and with a stamp, I think that's kind of finished. So that's basically what I was doing. I was typing, but I do a lot of writing in longhand too. So it's like missives from some other dimension. And you remember them to a degree, but they are kind of like lost selves. That there was a time when I was writing a lot of plays and being involved with other people, which is very collaborative kind of art. And obviously having a really exciting time, but that's all over with, There was a time when my husband, Ray Smith, and I would go bicycling like every day, and we did so many things together. And when I read about that, it's always Ray and I, Ray and me, And like this little unit of Ray and me, that's completely gone. It's been gone since 2008. So when you look into the past like that, it's very poignant. I mean, I don't want to say it's horrific, because that's sort of morbid, but it just is a little shocking, Have you ever looked at old letters of yours?
Yeah, I find it disorienting and often just very embarrassing. It's so obvious what it was that I wanted from them, whereas it's not obvious to me right now. When you were talking about the dog having the dogness and the negotiation of wanting to basically be in communion with the other, but needing to respond to what is essentially dog-like. As you were saying that, I thought that's a pretty good description of every interaction that anybody ever has with anybody, whether they're two humans or a human and an animal. But you're not usually aware of it. In the present, it's very hard to be aware of both your own humanness and what it is that you want out of the other. But when you look back at old letters, it can be very embarrassing because you see your own.
Well, my letters are not really like that. My letters are just sort of completely off the top of my head. And I'm writing to my biographer, who's a friend. He's a really nice person. But if I were writing to some wealthy patron, let's say, maybe then it would have a different tone. But what I was doing with Greg, he could have been my brother. Okay? Now, most of us in our lifetimes may have one or two people with whom we write that way. But Greg is the only person in my life, and which is completely just accidental. Now, I know you were doing emails with Natalie Portman.
Among others, yeah.
But that must have been sort of the same kind of thing where you would just write about anything that struck you and, back and forth. But then you lost them.
I lost all of my emails from before 2006.
So how many years was that?
I mean, all of my emails I guess I first got an email address in 98, something like that.
Didn't you feel awful losing all that?
No, not really. I mean,
but you didn't know what you'd lost, you see. Because I didn't know what those in those letters. Like, you don't really know what you lost, really. You wouldn't remember it.
My feeling is that once it's done, it's done, and it can be interesting, but it can satisfy a curiosity, right? To look back. In a way, that's what this book made me think a lot about losing people. It's been a sort of theme of these questions and of your comments. And I found when Philip Roth died, it had a really peculiar effect on me, because I thought, well, that's it. Like this person who had achieved the kind of height of literary fame, of literary respect, is now in the ground, and soon enough people will stop reading his books, because that's what happens, and then it's over. And so it made me think really differently about, I think, like the inspiration for why looking back at old letters or looking back at old books would matter. And I'm so much more interested in my own life, in what you were saying about you wake up excited to write.
Yeah, we all live in the present tense. And I think all the artists are just really concerned with right now and with the future project, definitely. And we don't necessarily look back. But I think Philip is going to continue to be read. Saul Bellow is certainly read. I mean, these are great writers. And people who are writing like in the 1890s, Kate Chopin, let's say, they were not read at the time they were writing, and then they died and were not read, but then they were sort of resurrected. So people read Kate Chopin now who were not reading during her lifetime. So that's not necessarily true. But basically, there are two ways to look at life. When somebody dies, you might think with a kind of Buddhist resignation that was meant to be. The life was this long and it stopped. Or you may think with more maybe spontaneous or natural grief and anguish. You think, no, that can't be. No, it can't be. I don't believe it. He died too young. I mean, there are different ways of looking at the cataclysms of life. So when you say you lost all those letters of yours, you have a resignation. You've sort of talked yourself into thinking that had to be. Whereas another person may be tearing his hair out. Oh my God, I lost something that's really valuable. They're just different ways of dealing with loss, I think.
It may be a different way of locating value. Like, I appreciated having lost it, that I didn't value it as much as I thought I did.
Well, you don't really know. That's something you're telling yourself too. We tell ourselves stories we're all in a state of denial. I mean, collectively, we are in this state of denial about climate change. And just if I bring it up, people are yawning. Like, you can't somehow absorb what it means, so people have all kinds of defenses. Or they say, well, I won't be around long enough for it to matter. But I think we tell ourselves all sorts of different things, and I notice in myself that basically, if I'm working, and probably that's true with Jonathan also, if I'm actually working, I don't think about any of these things. It's like grabbing a rope, and you're being dragged along, you're being dragged along a river or whatever. Instead of making your way in some laborious and arduous way, you're being sort of pulled along, and you don't think about anything else. You don't even think about the losses. Sometimes you don't think about being hungry. You're writing at 3 a.m. in the morning, and you're not thinking about, oh my God, I have to get up tomorrow. You're just sort of doing, it's like electric. And I think that's what we live for as artists.
One more question, and then we'll go to the questions that people wrote. One of the nice things about this book is it spans time. And so you get a sense of not only the changes in your life, but cultural changes. There's in one letter you said to Greg Johnson, the biographer, actually you would love email. It's probably better for you that you don't explore it. You might become addicted. I certainly could be, but stay away from the computer, preferring to type letters as I type prose fiction. Emails are sort of delicious post-literate means of communication, somewhere between a letter and a telegram, or between voicemail and fax. You are a teacher, and you have taught students you taught me before the internet was vibrant.
Yeah, back in the Stone Age, actually. Before I was even at Princeton, I was teaching.
And when you look at your students now, people who are becoming writers in this culture, what do you think about technological advances or cultural advances have made it better to be a writer now than it was before, or have made it more difficult to be a writer?
Well, I think because of the nature of the sort of teaching that I do, and it may be true of people who teach art and music too, my students, including you, the students are all very ahistoric and individual. Like when I first started teaching a long time ago in Detroit, I can remember the names of some of the students from my first class at the University of Detroit. Now, they were very special. They may have been self-selected, because writing students are self-selected. I'm not teaching students taking required courses. It's not like remedial English. The students that we see want to take writing, so they're almost always people who are already writing. So whether it's 1979 or 1991 or 2015, you have a class of odd, quirky, indefinable people who are individuals. And whether they're writing in longhand, which some of them do even today, or whether they're writing on computers, they are sort of unique. You're in that category, that you could have been my student in 1968 or 2023, that there's just something about an original, odd imagination that isn't necessarily dependent on the context of history. Like if we had young Charles Dickens in our workshops at NYU, young Charles Dickens, he's writing this crazy, kinetic, visceral language, or Shelley or Keats, or particularly Emily Dickinson or Dylan Thomas, are kind of these special voices. It wouldn't matter if they were typing or whether they're writing with longhand or dictaphone, somehow it doesn't seem to matter. How do you feel about your students?
I think that, culture influences the imagination and also influences habits. And I think it's not a great moment for writerly habits, because things like quiet have been devalued, or they've lost their space. Things like the need to make mistakes on the way to figuring out what it is you believe has become scary rather than exciting. And concentration has been fragmented. And those are it's very hard to write a novel without those things.
It was probably always hard to write a novel. I mean,
maybe it's harder.
It would have been harder to write. It's hard to write even a bad novel, you know. But, you know, I lived in a sorority house when I was an undergraduate. Talk about quiet. Quiet being valued. I have news for you. Being an undergraduate at any stage was just very noisy and fragmented. All sorts of interruptions constantly. So I don't know that. I don't actually think there probably is that much difference. I think one of the differences is more almost vulgar and economical. It's that there are not as many publishers. I mean, this is something a little different from what we've been talking about. That when I was a young writer, there were like maybe 30 different publishers, and a lot of them were family-owned publishing houses. So a family-owned publishing house meant if somebody liked your work, they were going to publish it and say it sold 500 copies. Nonetheless, if they liked it, they were going to publish the next book and the next book. So a lot of great writers were nurtured, like Faulkner sold almost nothing when, you know, he came along kind of slowly, and many others too. That's different. Now, with a first novel, a person could sell 1 million copies or almost nothing, but there won't be a second novel if they don't sell much. I think that's different, definitely. But some of our students at NYU, if they're writing the right novel and it catches on, they could have enormous bestsellers. And that probably wasn't going to happen at all when I was young.
We have a couple questions.
Okay.
With Alice Munro's recent passing, could you share any memorable interactions with her or a favorite Munro story or collection that particularly moved you?
Could you repeat that?
With Alice Munro's recent passing?
Oh, Alice Munro, yeah.
Could you share any memorable interactions with her or a favorite story of hers?
Well, I never met Alice Munro. I did live in Canada for 10 years, and I'm friendly with Margaret Atwood, who of course is a younger contemporary of Alice Munro. Margaret Atwood did know Alice Munro quite well. I had read her work from stories of girls and women, and The Beggar Maid, some of her early work. I was aware of her from the very beginning. And speaking of Margaret Atwood, I was aware of Margaret Atwood when she was a poet. You know, she started writing novels a little bit later. So I think of some of these writers the way they were almost when they were girls. They were really very young. So the early Alice Munro, stories of girls, stories of flow. And Rose, Flo and Rose, right? The mother and the daughter, or maybe a stepmother and a daughter. Those were very wonderful stories, and they were sort of age appropriate because Alice Munro was writing about herself at that age, like in her 20s, let's say. And then when I was reading them, I was probably about the same age, or maybe a little younger. So then as time goes by, Alice Munro's writing gets more complicated. The stories get longer and more dense. And later in her life, she got more interested in her own history, like I think it was Scottish history, and was doing some research, which in the beginning she wasn't doing. But I like a whole lot of her work. I wouldn't necessarily single out anything in particular. The Love of a Good Woman, that's a relatively long story in the New Yorker.
Can you please share a memory of growing up in your grandparents' farmhouse on Transit Road? I live in Buffalo, and I've driven by it.
Oh, well, the old farmhouse is gone. It was built in 1888, and we lived in it for quite a while. We lived, by we, I mean my parents and my brother Fred and me. We lived in this house with my mother's step-parents. So it was like a multi-generational household, which was very typical of that era. For people to get married and sort of just live in a house by themselves or an apartment is relatively recent, I think, in history, speaking sort of in anthropological terms. It used to be like multi-generational, or even like a compound where some of your aunt, uncle might live next door, and it was sort of like family compounds. So that was very wonderful, and I was very lucky. And I guess it's just sheer luck. I grew up at a time after the Depression, when there was a good deal of poverty, and there were many families in the immediate vicinity where they were very dysfunctional because of alcoholism or just sort of brutality and people being cruel to one another. But my family wasn't like that. I was just extremely lucky.
Maybe we could end, if you wouldn't mind sharing, you described the feeling of waking up and being excited to start the day, or being 3 a.m. and being so involved in something.
Right.
What is exciting you now?
Oh, well, I just got back yesterday from upstate New York. I was invited up to Lockport. There's a wonderful filmmaker, a documentarian named Paul Lamont. He's doing a documentary film on the Erie Barge Canal and cities like Lockport. Albany would be one, but Lockport's got the most locks, I think. So I was in Lockport a good deal of my time. My Jewish grandmother lived in Lockport. So I was just there, and I was introduced, posthumously to a great uncle named Michael Oates. And there's a statue of him because he was an Erie Barge Canal tender, as they would call, lock tender. So there's statues of some of these working men. I mean, it was really, really hard work. So I've been waking up kind of early in the morning in Lockport, just having all these thoughts about what I might want to write about this, and meeting somebody who was my father's uncle, who was working in 1897. He was from some western county in Ireland. And just seeing, I put this all on Twitter. If anybody follows Twitter, I put the picture of him, and there's a statue of him. And he has this kind of surly Irish bachelor look. He's even sitting off by himself. And that kind of feeling that each morning there's something unusual or something that wasn't there before. So I've been waking up early thinking about this and writing notes and sort of taking notes on it.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
And thank you.